actual solar objects to be seen, which are located at much closer distances. Billy says my speech also isn't of these actual suns but just of those very distant objects that are only visible from Earth as so-called stars, but in reality, these are very luminous nebulous formations or galaxies, which exhibit enormous dimensions of dozens or even hundreds of light years and which exist at distances of many light years, which must be counted in the dozens, hundreds, thousands, or even millions. Quetzal says my words also corresponded to this notion. Billy says excuse me, then it was a misunderstanding. And while we're already at it, unfortunately, it happens over and over again that misunderstandings arise, in connection with the old forms of speech, so also in connection with castration and sterilization, as these two concepts are called in the Talmud Yemanuel. Of course, I strive hard to clarify these misunderstandings in myself in the best possible manner, just in accordance with my knowledge. Over these two concepts and their actual meaning, I was instructed in such a way by Sfath, and also the storage banks freely gave the same information, that the action of castration and sterilization in the old sense and, thus, also in the sense of the Talmud Yemanuel didn't mean that the fallible ones, who were included in this action, had their gender deformed or removed. Rather, the sterilization and castration quite simply took place through the fact that the possibility of bisexual sexual intercourse was taken from the fallible ones, in that they were separated from the opposite sex and were taken to places of compliance, where in accordance with the gender of the fallible ones only those of the same sex had to serve their term, respectively their punishment, as this is simply called today. As Sfath explained, this separation from the presence of the opposite sex corresponded to the so-called castration and sterilization because through this action, no bisexual relations and, thus, no bisexual sexual intercourse could take place anymore, which also prevented that fallible descendants could be produced. This, in turn, ensured that no fallible ones respectively criminals, and with these, social child elements could be placed into the world, who would have then enjoyed a bad upbringing by their fallible parents and by their environment and would have even become fallible ones, criminals, and asocial ones. In addition, now the question as to whether this was also kept and handled in such a way with your ancient peoples, since this law goes back to the age-old laws of Henk and Enoch, whose most distant descendants are your peoples. And what about today? If this law applied to you in earlier times, does it still also apply today? Quetzal says what you have just explained also corresponds to the truth. And in fact, it is also the case that all our ancient peoples handled the law addressed by you to its full extent. The law still invariably applies today, but it already hasn't been put to use for several millenniums, due to the fact that there are no more fallible ones, criminals, and asocial elements among us. Billy says Sfath already enlightened me as a small boy about the fact that new religious sects will continuously arise and run rampant starting from the 50s, even so-called UFO sectarianism, parapsychology sectarianism, and esoteric sectarianism, which has also proven itself to be true since that time, like also many other things that he predicted to me for the future. His words were that as a result of this, very bad things and events would occur, which has also, unfortunately, proven itself to be true. Against this sectarianism, so I think something should be done, which I would do with great pleasure. Unfortunately, I see no great chances therein if I would strive for this, but this still won't keep me from raising my voice against it, which certainly won't make me more popular, however. So far, I have only had bad experiences. The question is whether there is still any sense to it. What do you think? Quetzal says your actions relating to this are well known to us. Thus, we also know that you are badly attacked from a more religious as well as from a purely sectarian side, which is certain to bring you unpleasantness in time and even legal actions against you because sectarians, who are attacked with the truth, usually defend themselves vehemently, in order to downplay and to deny their wrongdoings. Sectarians are liars, swindlers, and cheats who are only out to rally believers and enslaved ones around themselves, in order to exploit these and to be able to position themselves in the light and in the forefront, as self-appointed eminences and divinities of their own graces or as representatives of a god or any allegedly high and lofty as well as all-knowing and powerful extraterrestrial, etc. But we have already talked about this. Billy says right, but that doesn't answer my question as to whether I should continue in my actions against sectarianism. Quetzal says we must leave this to your decision and responsibility, even if we think that your actions relating to this are right and desirable for the dissemination of the truth. Billy says that is a clear answer. With this, I also know that I'm really going to incur legal action and more religious and sectarian enemies. Then so be it, and then I can also immediately lash out on the timpani with what I say now, which will then also be written down as a contact conversation and be spread throughout the world. So then religions and sects sow hatred and separation of the people among themselves, and they drive their believers, enslaved ones, and fanatics into harming, abusing, fighting, and eradicating those of other beliefs. Since ancient times, religions and sects do not create peace, freedom, harmony, and love, but rather animosity, anger, quarrel and rage, as well as blind fury, racial hatred, hatred against other faiths, bondage, dependence, servitude, slavery, war and strife, distress, misery, sorrow, anxiety and fear, delusional faith, superiority over other people, autonomy, and many other serious evils, through which murder and mayhem prevail among the earth people. Through the insanity of the religions and sects, it has been determined since time immemorial as to what lives are worth living, namely only those who belongs to one's own religion or sect, while everything else is heathenistic, damnable, unworthy of eradication. Through their dogmas, delusional beliefs, and fanaticism, the religions and sects determine the insanity and the inhumanity of making war upon and exploiting those of other faiths. It is even determined as to who owns the goods, the property, and the country, and as to what nations and what states have a right to live or not. Religions and sects determine the existence or non-existence of people, nations, and states. And religions and sects are the most powerful and most dangerous means of power and force, as well as of the wars, the capital, the exploitation, and the deception of the people. In the foreground, they preach love and peace, but in the background, they create, demand, and promote murder and mayhem, robbery and terrorism against those of other faiths, in order to bring their own religion or sect to power, no matter how much human blood flows and is shed, and no matter how much pain, sorrow, grief, distress, and misery, as well as hatred and terrorism develop again by this. However, almost no person wants to hear or know these truths, because the real truth is not in demand but only lies and deceit, swindling and fraud, as well as deception. These worthless ones are the ones to whom people give their attention and their faith. Thus, it happens that every prophet or every prophetess of the truth is banished to the desert, where they can no longer be heard. And in fact, it is also the case that those who announce the effective truth become designated as sectarians by their critics and enemies and become attacked, slandered, and denigrated. And this, even though between a sectarian or sect and prophet or prophetess, there is such a huge difference in the effective truth, which should actually be recognized by a rational person. But obviously, the critics and enemies are devoid of any reason in this regard. They only practice criticism and slander in order to assert themselves for the sake of material rewards, for they are hostile to the truth, or the truth simply does not penetrate into the brains of the critics or slanderers due to their own arrogance. One reason for this may be that their reason and intellect are not strong enough, so the real truth cannot be recognized. But there are still many other reasons for this, and enumerating them all would probably fill books. Quetzal says those are words that are not to be denied. Billy says there's still much more to say, namely that by and large, The Earth people aren't actually interested in the effective truth but only in unreal things.